He was just a quiet cook at the VFW, until a young soldier recognized his Medal of Honor. Tattoo, Private First Class. Evan Brooks stopped mid-step, his food tray trembling slightly in his hands. The fluorescent lights of VFW Post 1427's kitchen cast harsh shadows across the grill, but they couldn't hide what he'd just seen. There, on the forearm of the quiet man flipping burgers, was a tattoo that made Evan's breath catch in his throat. The older man looked up, his weathered face creased with decades of unspoken stories. His sleeves were rolled up to beat the heat from the grill, revealing faded ink that most people would glance at and forget. But Evan wasn't most people. He'd spent countless hours in basic training, memorizing symbols, studying heroes, learning what it meant to serve. "Sir," Evan's voice was barely above a whisper, respectful but urgent. "Is that what I think it is?" The cook's eyes narrowed, and for just a moment something flickered behind them, something that spoke of distant battlefields and choices that changed everything. He turned back to the grill, his voice quiet but firm. "Best keep your eyes on your meal, soldier. Some things are meant to stay quiet, but some secrets are too big to stay buried forever." Cal Mercer had been running the kitchen at VFW Post 1427 for nearly 8 years, and in all that time, nobody had ever called him anything but Cookie. He arrived every morning at 5:30 sharp, unlocked the back door with keys that barely made a sound, and began his ritual. Coffee first, then prep for whatever the day demanded. Friday fish fries, Saturday pancake breakfasts, Sunday dinners for the families who couldn't afford much else. At 74, Cal moved with the precision of a man who'd learned that wasted motion could mean wasted lives. His hands were steady. On the spatula, his timing perfect, his portions generous. He spoke only when spoken to, smiled politely at compliments, and cleaned his station until it gleamed. The members of Post 1427 appreciated him the way you appreciate good weather, grateful when it's there, but not thinking much about where it came from. The VFW Post itself sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd in Millbrook, Ohio, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The building had been there since 1952, a squat brick structure with American flags flanking the entrance, and a parking lot that filled up on Friday nights when the fish was fresh and the beer was cold. Inside, faded photographs lined the walls. Young, faces in uniform, some who'd made it home, some who hadn't. A dusty display case held ribbons and medals donated by families who wanted their loved ones remembered. Cal fit into this world like he'd been born to it. He wore simple clothes, jeans, plain t-shirts, work boots that had seen better decades. His gray hair was always neat, his face clean-shaven, his manner respectful but reserved. The tattoos on his arms told stories, but they were stories he kept to himself. Most were standard military ink, unit patches, dates, names of places that meant something to someone who'd been there. One, though, was different. It sat on his right forearm, partially hidden by sleeve lines and time, intricate enough to catch the eye, but subtle enough that most people assumed it was just another piece of military nostalgia. The members of Post 1427 had their own stories, their own scars, their own reasons for gathering in a place where nobody asked too many questions. They played dominoes at corner tables, argued politics without real heat, and shared the kind of comfortable silence that came from understanding each other without words. They knew Cal had served. You didn't end up cooking at a VFW without having earned your place, but they didn't pry. Some stories were meant to be told when the teller was ready. Commander Art Delgado, a Vietnam veteran who'd run the post for the past 12 years, had tried a few times to draw Cal out. Art had a knack for reading people, and something about Cal suggested depths that most men spent lifetimes trying to forget. But every gentle inquiry was met with the same polite deflection, the same quiet smile that said the subject was closed. "Good work today, Cookie," Art would say after a particularly successful fish fry. "Just doing my job, Commander," Cal would reply, already turning back to his cleaning. It was a dance they'd perfected over the years, respectful and distant, the way men who'd seen too much learned to coexist without stepping on each other's carefully guarded territories. Private First Class Evan Brooks had been back from his deployment for 3 weeks, and he still jumped every time a car backfired. At 22, he was old enough to vote and young enough to believe that coming home should feel easier than it did. His apartment felt too quiet. His civilian clothes felt wrong, and the space between who he'd been before and who he was now seemed to grow wider every day. His mother had suggested the VFW. "They'll understand," she'd said, squeezing his shoulder the way she had when he was small and afraid of thunder. Sometimes you need to be around people who've walked the same path. Evan had resisted at first. He wasn't like those older guys, wasn't ready to sit in a corner nursing a beer and talking about the old days. His war was fresh, still sharp in his memory, and he wasn't sure he wanted to share it with strangers. But the silence in his apartment had gotten too loud, and the well-meaning sympathy of friends who'd never left Ohio had started to feel like wearing shoes that didn't fit. So on a Friday evening in late September, when the air still held summer's warmth but carried autumn's promise, Evan pushed through the doors of VFW Post 1427 for the first time. The smell hit him immediately: fried fish, cigarette smoke, and something else, something indefinable that every military gathering seemed to carry. It was the smell of shared experience, of stories that didn't need to be told because everyone already knew the important parts. The main hall was busier than he'd expected. Families occupied most of the tables, kids running between chairs while their parents caught up with friends. A handful of older men clustered around the bar, their conversation low and punctuated by the occasional laugh. Everyone seemed to belong except him. Evan found a table near the back and ordered the fish dinner, more because it gave him something to do with his hands than because he was hungry. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Dolores, brought him sweet tea without being asked. "First time?" she said, and when he nodded, she smiled. "Cookie makes the best fish in 3 counties. You picked a good night." When his number was called, Evan made his way to the kitchen window, where a line had formed of people waiting for their orders. That's when he saw him, the cook, an older man with gray hair and steady hands, moving with the kind of efficiency that came from decades of practice. The man worked quietly, focused on his tasks, acknowledging each customer with a nod but little else. Evan was reaching for his plate when he saw it. The cook's sleeves were rolled up against the heat, and there on his right forearm, partially hidden by the angle of his arm and the kitchen's harsh lighting, was a tattoo that made Evan's heart skip. Most people would have seen just another piece of military ink, faded and ordinary. But Evan had spent hours in basic training studying military decorations, memorizing the symbols that represented the highest levels of courage and sacrifice. His drill sergeant had been obsessed with military history, had made them learn not just the names of Medal of Honor recipients, but the stories behind their heroism. And one of the things Evan remembered most clearly was the distinctive star-shaped design of the Medal of Honor itself, the way it looked, the way it was worn, and yes, the way some veterans chose to honor it in permanent ink. The tattoo on the cook's arm wasn't just any military symbol. It was the Medal of Honor insignia, rendered in careful detail by someone who understood its significance. Evan stared, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This quiet man, this cook, who went by Cookie and seemed to want nothing more than to be left alone, was wearing the mark of America's highest military decoration. "Something wrong with your order, son?" The cook's voice was gentle but firm, and Evan realized he'd been standing there for nearly a minute staring. Heat rushed to his face as he met the older man's eyes, and for just a moment, he saw something there that confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't just a tattoo chosen for its looks. This was a memorial, a reminder, a burden carried in ink and silence. "Sir," Evan found his voice. kept it respectful, kept it quiet. Is that what I think it is? The cook's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. His hands continued their work, flipping burgers and managing the grill, but Evan could feel the weight of his attention, the careful calculation of a man deciding how much truth to reveal. "Best keep your eyes on your meals, soldier," the cook said finally, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of command, even wrapped in the humble words of a kitchen worker. "Some things are meant to stay quiet." But as Evan walked back to his table, the cook's words echoing in his mind, he knew he'd stumbled onto something bigger than a Friday night fish fry. He'd found a story that deserved to be told, even if the man living it preferred the shadows. Evan tried to focus on his dinner, but the fish might as well have been cardboard. His mind kept circling back to that tattoo, to the way the cook had responded, to the possibility that seemed too incredible to believe. He'd grown up hearing stories about war heroes, but they were always distant figures from history books, not quiet men flipping burgers in small-town VFW halls. He found himself studying the other diners, wondering if any of them knew. The older veterans at the bar seemed comfortable with the cook, calling him Cookie and thanking him for the meal, but their interactions felt casual, ordinary. If they knew what Evan suspected, surely they'd treat him differently. Wouldn't they? The Medal of Honor wasn't just another decoration. It was the highest military award for valor, given only to those who distinguished themselves through conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Evan's drill sergeant had drilled that definition into their heads, had made them understand that fewer than 3,500 people in American history had received the honor. It wasn't something you wore casually or claimed lightly. As the evening wore on, Evan found excuses to walk past the kitchen window. Each time he caught glimpses of the cook at work, methodical, focused, professional. The tattoo was visible. When the man's sleeve rode up, but it was positioned in a way that suggested privacy rather than display. This wasn't someone advertising his heroism. This was someone carrying it quietly, the way some people carried grief or love or other things too precious for casual conversation. Finally, as the dinner crowd began to thin, Evan approached the bar where Commander Art Delgado was settling the evening's receipts. Art looked up as Evan approached, his weathered face creasing into a welcoming smile. "How was your first visit?" Art asked, closing the cash register with a satisfied snap. "Cookie's fish meet your expectations?" "Yes, sir," Evan said, then hesitated. "How did you ask about something like this? How did you voice a suspicion that seemed too big for the ordinary world of fish dinners and friendly conversation?" "Commander, can I ask you something about Cookie?" Art's expression grew more attentive. "What about him?" "How long has he been here?" "About 8 years now," Art said. "Showed up one day looking for work and we needed someone in the kitchen. Best decision we ever made." "Why?" Evan glanced toward the kitchen, where the cook was cleaning his station with the same methodical precision he'd shown all evening. "What do you know about his service?" "Same as most of the guys here. Served his country, did his duty, came home. Cal doesn't talk much about the details, and we don't push. Why the interest?" This was it. Either Evan was about to make a fool of himself, or he was about to change everything for the quiet man in the kitchen. He took a breath and committed. "Commander, I think Cookie might be a Medal of Honor recipient." Art's expression went very still. The register drawer clicked shut with finality, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant clatter of dishes being washed. When Art spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. "That's a serious thing to say, son. What makes you think that?" "His tattoo," Evan said. "The one on his right forearm. I saw it when I was getting my plate. It's the Medal of Honor insignia, sir. I'm sure of it." Art was quiet for a long moment, and Evan could see him thinking, processing, weighing possibilities. Finally, the older man nodded slowly. "Show me," he said. They waited until the kitchen had emptied, until Cookie was alone with his cleaning. Art approached the pass-through window with the casual manner of a man checking on his employee, but Evan could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he positioned himself to get a clear view. "Good night tonight, Cal," Art said, leaning against the counter. "That new family from the north side came in, the Hendersons. Said it was the best fish they'd had since moving here." Cal looked up from his cleaning, a genuine smile crossing his face. "Glad to hear it. Fresh fish makes all the difference." As he spoke, he reached across the counter to hand Art the evening's inventory sheet, and his sleeve rode up just enough. Just enough for Art to see what Evan had seen, to recognize what most people would miss. The commander's face went very pale, and his hand trembled slightly as he took the paper. "Cal," Art said quietly, and something in his tone made the cook look up sharply. "We need to talk." The conversation that followed happened in Art's office, a small room behind the main hall filled with filing cabinets, military memorabilia, and the accumulated paperwork of running a VFW post. Cal sat in the chair across from Art's desk, his hands folded calmly in his lap, while Evan stood near the door, suddenly uncertain whether he should be there at all. Art closed the office door and turned to face the cook, his expression mixing respect, curiosity, and something that might have been awe. On his desk, he'd placed a thick folder. Membership records, employment files, the bureaucratic debris of Cal's 8 years at the post. "Calvin Mercer," Art said, reading from the folder. "That's your real name according to your employment paperwork. Born in Akron, 1949. Enlisted in the Army in 1968. He looked up. "What it doesn't say is anything about a Medal of Honor." Cal's expression hadn't changed, but Evan noticed that his hands had tightened slightly, the knuckles showing white against his weathered skin. "Should it?" Cal asked quietly. "That depends," Art said, "on whether what Evan here saw was what he thinks he saw." For a long moment, the three men sat in silence. The office felt too small, too ordinary for the weight of what was being discussed. Outside, they could hear Dolores finishing her cleanup, the clink of glasses and the scrape of chairs being stacked for the night. Finally, Cal spoke. "What exactly did you see, son?" Evan straightened, feeling the formality of the moment, the sense that his answer mattered more than he'd realized. "The Medal of Honor insignia, sir. On your right forearm. I studied military decorations in basic training, and I know what it looks like." Cal was quiet for another moment, then slowly rolled up his sleeve. The tattoo was fully visible now, rendered in blue and black ink that had faded but not lost its detail. The distinctive star shape, the eagle, the careful script that surrounded. It was unmistakably the Medal of Honor, inked into the skin of a man who'd chosen to carry his honor quietly. "It's real," Art said, and it wasn't a question. "It's real," Cal confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. Art leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his gray hair. "Jesus, Cal, do you have any idea what this means? What you mean?" "It means I did my job a long time ago," Cal said. "It means I came home when a lot of good men didn't. It means I've been trying to make sense of that ever since." "What happened?" Evan asked, then immediately felt presumptuous. "I mean, if you don't mind saying, sir." Cal looked at him for a long moment, and Evan saw the man behind the cook for the first time. The weight he carried, the memories that shaped his quiet days, the burden of being singled out for something that felt to him like nothing more than doing what anyone would have done. "Vietnam," Cal said finally. 1970. I was a staff sergeant with the 1st Infantry Division. We were—" He paused, seeming to gather himself. "We were in a bad spot, ambush situation. I had men down, men who couldn't move. The enemy was closing in." He stopped, and in the silence Evan could almost hear the distant echo of gunfire, the cries of wounded soldiers, the terrible calculus of war where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death for people you'd sworn to protect. "There was a grenade," Cal continued, his voice steady but distant. Landed right in the middle of my squad. I didn't think. I covered it. Threw myself on top of it. Tried to give the others a chance to get clear. Art was staring at him, and Evan realized he was holding his breath. It went off? Evan asked. Cal nodded, rolling up his left sleeve to reveal scarring that Evan hadn't noticed before. Old wounds, carefully healed, but never forgotten. Tore me up pretty good, but it didn't kill me, and more importantly, it didn't kill them. After that, I managed to get my wounded out, held the position until reinforcements arrived, lost 3 men that day, but we saved 7, and they gave you the Medal of Honor, Art said. They tried to, Cal said. I fought it. Told them I was just doing what any soldier would do. But the Army doesn't ask your permission for these things. President Nixon hung it around my neck in 1971, and I've been carrying it ever since. The weight of his words settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Here was a man who'd thrown himself on a live grenade, survived, saved his squad, and spent the next 50 years cooking fish dinners and keeping his heroism to himself. Why? Art asked quietly. Why keep it secret? Cal was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of careful thought. Because it wasn't about me, he said. It was about them, the men I served with, the ones who didn't make it home. I survived when they didn't, and that's something I live with every day. The medal, it's not a prize. It's a responsibility. And I decided a long time ago that the best way to honor it was to keep serving, quietly, without making a big deal about what happened on one day in a war that took too many good people. He looked at both of them, his expression sincere but firm. I came here because I wanted to keep serving veterans, to do something useful with whatever time I had left. I didn't come here to be celebrated or recognized. I came here to work. Art. Stood up slowly, walked around his desk, and did something Evan had never seen him do in the months he'd been coming to the post. He saluted. Not the casual half gesture that veterans often shared, but a full, proper military salute, held with respect and precision. Staff Sergeant Mercer, he said formally, it's been an honor having you serve here. Cal looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he returned the salute with the same precision, the muscle memory of decades of service evident in every line of his posture. Thank you, Commander, he said, but I'm still just Cookie. That's all I ever wanted to be. But even as he said it, they all knew that everything had changed. Secrets this big didn't stay secret, especially not in a town like Millbrook. The question now wasn't whether Cal's story would come out, but how and what it would mean for the quiet man who'd spent 8 years trying to serve without recognition. Art Delgado had been a Marine in Vietnam, had learned the importance of verification. Before action, so he spent the weekend making phone calls. He started with the Veterans Administration, then worked his way through military records offices, finally reaching a retired colonel in Virginia who'd served with the 1st Infantry Division in 1970. Calvin Mercer, the colonel had said when Art mentioned the name. Jesus Christ. Cookie Mercer. I was a lieutenant then, served under him for 6 months. That man saved my life twice before he won the medal. Why? What's this about? By Monday morning, Art had confirmation from 3 different sources, copies of the citation, and photographs. From the award ceremony that showed a young Calvin Mercer standing next to President Nixon, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform while the Medal of Honor was placed around his neck. The citation was everything Cal had said and more. It described in clinical military language what sounded like something from a movie. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a squad leader with Company B, 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, in action against hostile forces on 15th of March 1970 in the Republic of Vietnam. The details were harrowing. Cal's squad had been pinned down by enemy fire, 3 men wounded, ammunition running low, when North Vietnamese forces began closing in for what appeared to be a final assault. The grenade had landed in their position, and Cal had reacted instantly, throwing himself on top of it while shouting for his men to take cover. The explosion had wounded him severely, but he'd continued to fight, organizing the evacuation of his wounded soldiers and holding the position for 43 minutes until reinforcements arrived. 7 men had lived because of Cal's actions. 3 had died, and Art could see in the clinical language of the citation the weight that Cal carried, not just for what he'd done, but for what he hadn't been able to prevent. Art made his decision on Monday afternoon. He called the local newspaper first, then the regional VA office, then his contacts at the State Veterans Organization. By Wednesday, he had a plan that he hoped would honor Cal's wishes for privacy while still giving him the recognition he deserved. The plan was simple: a quiet ceremony at the post, invitation only, for VFW members and their families. No media. Unless Cal agreed, no speeches unless he wanted to make them. No pressure to be anything other than what he'd been for 8 years, a man who served others. But small towns have their own momentum, and word traveled faster than Art had anticipated. By Thursday, the story was in the Millbrook Gazette. By Friday, it had been picked up by the Cleveland Plain Dealer. By the weekend, Cal's quiet life had become a regional news story about the Medal of Honor recipient who'd been hiding in plain sight. The phone at the VFW started ringing Saturday morning and didn't stop. Reporters wanting interviews, veterans organizations offering ceremonies, local politicians looking for photo opportunities. Art fielded the calls while Cal worked in the kitchen, preparing for what he thought would be a normal fish fry. It wasn't. Until 5 o'clock, when Cal walked into the main hall expecting to see the usual crowd of families and friends, that he realized his secret was out. The hall was packed beyond capacity, filled not just with the regular members but with people he didn't recognize. Veterans from other posts, active duty soldiers, families who'd driven hours to shake the hand of a genuine American hero. A banner hung across the back wall. "Welcome home, Staff Sergeant Mercer." The dusty display case had been cleaned and rearranged, with a place of honor reserved for the materials Art had gathered. The citation, the photographs, the documentation of a heroism that had been hidden for too long. Cal stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, and for a moment Evan thought he might turn around and leave. The cook's face had gone pale, and his hands were trembling slightly. This was exactly what he'd been avoiding for 8 years, exactly the kind of attention he'd come to Millbrook to escape. But then something happened that Evan would remember for the rest of his life. Without any prompting or organization, every person in that room, young and old, military and civilian, stranger and friend, stood up. They didn't salute or cheer or make any noise at all. They simply stood in respectful silence, acknowledging the presence of a man who'd earned their respect in a way that most of them could barely imagine. Commander Delgado stepped forward, carrying a wooden box that Evan recognized as the kind used to display military decorations. Inside, nestled on blue velvet, was a Medal of Honor. Not Cal's original, which was presumably locked away somewhere safe, but an official replica provided by the Department of Defense for occasions exactly like this. "Staff Sergeant Calvin Mercer," Art said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "On behalf of VFW Post 1427 and in recognition of your extraordinary heroism and your continued service to your fellow veterans, we want to say what should have been said a long time ago. Welcome home, and thank you." The applause that followed was thunderous but brief, and then the room fell silent again, waiting. Everyone understood that this moment belonged to Cal, that whatever he chose to say or do would define how the evening proceeded. Cal looked around the room, taking in the faces, some familiar, some new, all respectful. Finally, his gaze settled on Evan, who was standing near the kitchen door, and for just a moment, the older man smiled. "I came here to work," Cal said, his voice quiet but strong enough to reach every corner of the room. I came here to serve. Food to people who understand what service means. I didn't come here to be celebrated or recognized or treated like something special. He paused, and Evan could see him wrestling with emotions that had been carefully controlled for decades. But maybe, Cal continued, maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe the service I've been trying to do here, feeding people, being part of this community, maybe that's not separate from what happened in Vietnam. Maybe it's all the same thing. Maybe it's all about taking care of the people around you, doing what needs to be done, and not worrying too much about who gets the credit. He accepted the box from Art, holding it carefully, reverently. I want to thank Private Brooks here, he said, nodding toward Evan, for having the courage to ask questions and for reminding me that some stories are meant to be shared, even when you'd rather keep them to yourself. The evening that followed was unlike anything the VFW had ever hosted. People shared their own stories, thanked Cal for his service, and gradually, the formal atmosphere gave way to something warmer, more familiar. Cal returned to the kitchen, not to hide, but to do what he did best, serve others. The difference was that now everyone knew exactly who was doing the serving. In the weeks that followed, life at VFW Post 1427 settled into a new rhythm. The initial media attention faded. The curious visitors moved on to other stories, and Cal was able to return to something approaching his normal routine. But something fundamental had changed, not just for him, but for everyone who'd witnessed that evening. The Wall of Honor now included Cal's photograph and citation, positioned prominently but not ostentatiously among the other service members, who'd made Post 1427 their second home. Visitors would occasionally ask about it, and whoever was on duty would tell the story with the kind of casual pride that suggested they'd been telling it for years rather than weeks. Cal himself seemed different, not dramatically so, but in small ways that Evan noticed during his now regular visits to the post. The cook was still quiet, still focused on his work, but there was something lighter about him, as if sharing the weight of his story had made it easier to carry. He'd started joining the conversations more often, sharing opinions about everything, from football to politics, contributing to the comfortable atmosphere that made the VFW feel like home for so many veterans. The most significant change was in how others treated him. It wasn't that they were more respectful. Respect had never been in short supply at Post 1427. It was that they were more relaxed around him, more willing to share their own stories, their own struggles with adjusting to civilian life or dealing with the aftermath of service. Cal had become not just the cook, but a confessor, a counselor, someone whose own experience with extraordinary circumstances made him uniquely qualified to listen to the ordinary difficulties that veterans faced every day. Evan found himself visiting the post 2 or 3 times a week, not because he was lonely anymore, but because he genuinely enjoyed the company. He'd started helping in the kitchen during busy nights, learning from Cal how to manage the controlled chaos of feeding a crowd, while maintaining quality and efficiency. It was practical education, but it was also something more, a way of connecting with the man whose tattoo had started everything. One evening in late October, as they were cleaning up after a particularly busy fish fry, Cal asked Evan the question that had been hanging unspoken between them for weeks. "You doing okay, son? I mean, really okay?" Evan paused in his wiping down of the prep counter, considering the question seriously. A month ago, he might have given the standard answer. "Fine, sir. Thanks for asking." But Cal's own honesty had earned him something more genuine. "Better," Evan said finally. "Not perfect, but better. Coming here helps. Having something to do, people to be around who understand. It makes a difference." Cal nodded, continuing his methodical cleaning of the grill. "Service helps," he said. "Not the fighting kind, necessarily, but the serving kind. Giving people something they need, being useful, it's good medicine for what war does to your head. Is that why you stayed here so long, even after people found out about the medal?" Cal thought about that for a moment, his hands moving with, practiced efficiency as he scraped down the cooking surface. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I just finally realized that hiding from who you are doesn't make you someone else. I am a Medal of Honor recipient. I also happen to be a pretty good cook. Both things can be true at the same time." Outside, autumn was settling over Millbrook, turning the leaves golden and bringing the kind of crisp evenings that made people want to gather in warm, well-lit places. The VFW was busier than usual, filled with the comfortable noise of conversation and laughter, the clink of glasses and the scrape of chairs. "Evan," Cal said as they finished their cleaning, "I want to tell you something. That night when you recognized my tattoo, when you decided to speak up about it, that took courage. Different kind of courage than what I needed in Vietnam, but courage all the same. You could have just minded your own business, pretended you hadn't seen anything." "Why would I do that?" "Because it's easier," Cal said simply. "Because getting involved in other people's stories is always more complicated than walking away. Because sometimes when you speak up, you change things in ways you can't predict or control." He hung up his apron and turned to face Evan directly. "But you did speak up, and I'm grateful for that. Not because I wanted the attention or the recognition, but because keeping that secret was getting heavier every year. I needed someone to see who I really was, not just who I was trying to be." 3 months later, on a cold January morning, Evan was helping with the Saturday breakfast crowd when his mother stopped by the post for the first time. She'd been curious about the place that had become such an important part of her son's routine, and Evan had finally worked up the courage to invite her. She sat at a corner table, nursing coffee and watching the controlled chaos of a busy weekend morning. Veterans and their families filled the room, conversations flowing around topics that ranged from grandchildren to politics to the upcoming fishing season. At the center of it all was Cal, moving between kitchen and dining room with quiet authority, making sure everyone had what they needed. "That's him?" she asked Evan when he stopped by her table with the coffee pot. "That's him," Evan confirmed. "Calvin Mercer. Staff Sergeant Mercer. Cookie, depending on how you know him." She studied Cal for a moment, taking in his simple efficiency, the way he seemed to know exactly what each customer needed before they asked, the genuine smile he offered to everyone who thanked him for the meal. "He saved lives," she said quietly. "He did," Evan agreed, "and now he still feeds people every day. Mom, that's what real heroes look like." As if sensing their conversation, Cal looked up from the grill and caught Evan's eye. He smiled, not the polite, professional smile he'd worn during his years of hiding, but something warmer, more genuine, the smile of a man who'd found peace, with all the different parts of his story. Later that morning, as the breakfast crowd thinned and the cleaning began, Evan found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them all to this point. A young soldier's recognition of an old tattoo, a commander's decision to investigate, a hero's reluctant acceptance of recognition, a community's embracing of the extraordinary man who'd been serving them all along. It wasn't the kind of story that ended with dramatic fanfare or perfect resolution. Real life was messier than that, more complicated. But it was the kind of story that reminded everyone involved that heroism wasn't just about extraordinary moments in extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes it was about showing up every day, doing the work that needed to be done, and taking care of the people around you. Cal continued to work at Post 1427, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The Medal of Honor citation was on the wall, but the man himself was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes with the same precision he'd once used to save lives, serving others with the same dedication that had earned him the nation's highest honor for valor.